The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, former Secretary of Agriculture Dan Glickman makes an urgent call for climate-smart agriculture. Wyoming Democratic Party Chair Joe Barbuto lays out a plan to prevail in the midterms. And election law expert Rick Hasan tells Bill Press why election subversion is the greater threat to American democracy than voter suppression. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. There's a growing acknowledgment that even as agriculture feels some of the worst impacts of climate change, it also contributes to the crisis. Former Secretary of Agriculture Dan Glickman says farmers can be part of the solution and public policy can help them do that. And we say hello to Dan Glickman, who represented Kansas's 4th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1977 to 1995, served as Secretary of Agriculture from 1995 to 2001. He is also the author, most recently, of Laughing at Myself, My Education in Congress, On the Farm, and at the Movies. Secretary Glickman, thanks for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Delighted to be with you. And to be with all the Democrats out there, too.
Absolutely. And our pleasure to have you with us. So let's talk agriculture and climate change. You recently wrote an op-ed co-authored with Bob Stallman about the impact of climate change on agriculture and the global food supply and how farmers and ranchers can mitigate a growing crisis. As you look at agriculture in the U.S. today, what do you consider the most alarming repercussions of climate change?
I'd say volatile weather. So droughts, floods, the inconsistency of weather, unpredictability of weather. There's no industry that's more impacted by the weather than agriculture. And the big thing is to make sure that farmers and ranchers are resilient enough to be able to deal with those vagaries. And there are obviously disaster programs and crop insurance and others that protect them. But in the longer term, we're going to have to figure out a way to help farmers cope with this, with new farming techniques, soil programs, no-till agriculture, using better feed so animals don't expel as much methane. I mean, there are just a whole bunch of things that we're learning about right now that can help farmers deal with a lot of the issues, in climate change. And the other big issue is water. So there's probably it's ironic because we're going to get a giant deluge of water where I'm living right now this afternoon, but no industry is more dependent upon water than agriculture. 70% of the water in the world is used to irrigate crops and feed animals. 30% is for everything else. And so as we get into this climate change issue, we're going to have to figure out a way to use water more efficiently, find better crops, new technologies so that we're not using as much water because we're not going to have it. The aquifers in my area and the whole heartland are falling rather precipitously. So this is an issue that needs also immediate attention.
Mm-hmm. And also, as you noted in the op-ed, agriculture is part of the problem. So how does farming and ranching contribute to climate change?
Well, clearly overutilization of crop inputs, pesticides, herbicides, other kinds of things, that has an environmental impact. It probably increases the emission of carbon into the atmosphere. So anything that reduces the amount of carbon in the atmosphere is going to be really important. So that means new techniques on tillage, whether it's no-till or other kinds of things, will certainly be helpful. And also, as I mentioned before, finding animal feed that produces less methane that's going into the atmosphere. All this requires a healthy agriculture research budget. We're a productive nation agriculturally. In large part, we've had this significant agriculture research infrastructure, USDA, the land grant college systems, and the private sector. And we've seen those numbers on research go down over the last decade or two. And we can't let that happen, because the only way farmers and ranchers are going to be able to stay alive and cope with climate change is through science.
Well, and obviously there is some work being done to reduce emissions from agriculture. What would you consider some of the more promising efforts that you see right now?
First of all, the USDA is doing a great job, and their Natural Resources Conservation System, NRCS, is helping farmers deal with a variety of conservation techniques, conservation tillage, taking land out of production where it's highly erodible, and then the research budget. And so we're also seeing, frankly, a whole generation of younger farmers much more sensitive to climate and agricultural changes. For a while, I think agriculture fought climate change because they thought that they were being singled out, picked on, so to speak. But we're all in this together, and our food supply chain really does depend upon us producing food sustainably. And so I think everybody's kind of in that game now. They weren't for a long time, but I think they are now.
Is there a difference between, say, the mega giants in agriculture versus the small-time farmers as far as the climate change goes, and how they're approaching things?
I think that kind of everybody's getting within the act, but to go to your basic question, the very large agricultural producers have gotten bigger over the last 20 and 30 and 40 and 50 years. A lot of this has to do with the economies of scale, and also the failure to enforce our antitrust laws, which is now we're beginning to see both this administration and Congress starting to get really interested in making sure that whether it's the Packers and Stockyards Act or our antitrust laws are properly enforced. But the truth of the matter is that we need to provide more incentives for smaller and more diversified farmers to survive. And I think that ought to be one of the goals of public policy in this country.
Well, and you also note in your op-ed that current efforts do not go far enough. What's missing from an overall strategy to address the role of agriculture and climate change?
I think it's actually starting to happen. The Biden administration has, in fact, put agriculture as a key part of our national strategy. And quite frankly, historically, agriculture has not been a key part of our national economic strategy generally. It's been considered kind of a niche strategy. Well, we'll let the farmers and ranchers have their money or their thing, and it won't be part of the bigger issues. But I think that the Biden administration and Secretary Vilsack are showing real leadership in trying to elevate the role of food production and all the ramifications of food production into climate strategy, and especially as we try to reduce carbon into the atmosphere, sink it in the ground, doing all sorts of other things. And it also goes back to this R&D, research and development. We got to just make sure we spend the resources to look down the road 10, 15, and 20 years, because that's one of the reasons why agriculture has been so productive in America.
We're speaking to Dan Glickman, former congressman from Kansas's 4th Congressional District, also former Secretary of Agriculture from 1995 to 2001, and also author most recently of Laughing at Myself, My Education in Congress, On the Farm, and at the Movies. You serve on the board of the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, and along with the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers in Action, you launched an initiative called Ag Mission to address this issue. What are some of the accomplishments of Ag Missions so far?
Well, first of all, the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research was a great effort led by Congress to put a whole bunch of money into ag research that was not otherwise being done by our land grant schools or our private companies. And so we're working on things like photosynthesis, how to make crops grow faster using less inputs, how to use water more efficiently, desalinization techniques and brackish water for irrigation, making crops that are more nutritious. And so these are all the kinds of programs that they're working on. And you know what's exciting about it is that not only are we getting traditional interests in agriculture, but there's an enormous amount of public investment in a lot of these new technologies. And the trick is to make sure they help smaller and medium-sized farmers, because in the past, they've tended to help the big guys, but not the average family-sized operation. But it's very exciting to see now a lot of people talking about food and agriculture is a key part of how America can do a better job in coping with climate change.
Yeah, I would have to say it's finally in the forefront, where it's always been sort of brushed aside, it seems, in recent years. But the climate crisis is unfolding at the same time the global population is growing, which means more food will have to be produced. So this is kind of tricky. How will this impact the goal of reining in agriculture's carbon footprint?
Well, first of all, interesting. It's a great question, but we throw away or waste about 35% of our food that's grown or sold. That is, it's the surplus food that's not eaten or used or just thrown in the trash can is about a third of our food production. So imagine if we could deal with that issue alone. Not only could we probably feed more hungry people in the world, but we'd probably reduce the climate impact, of the carbon impact of that excessive type production. So one of the ways is to look at how do we produce food with less waste, and that's a big challenge. And at the same time, we have millions of very hungry people in this country who are blessed with the ability to get that surplus food. But we're going to have to feed 9.5, 10 billion people, 11 billion people. Right now, we're about 7.4 billion people. And we're going to have to do that without using any more water and without overdoing the world with crop inputs, with fertilizer, pesticides. I mean, we're going to need to use them in some degree, but we've got to use them much more judiciously than we used them before. And there's one other thing which has to do with it. The Agriculture Department is the owner and the housing the U.S. Forest Service. So not only do you have drought and excessive rainfall, but now we have fires that are just this enormous problem, not only in the forests of the West, which are under the Department of Agriculture, but rangeland fires and fires in parts of this country that we've never seen before. So this is really caused by climate change, because we're seeing America burning at a rate we've never seen before, and the rest of the world as well. So this is a problem we just all have to work on collectively. And now, as you point out, it's a high priority in agriculture. They know that we're part of the problem, but we're also a big part of the solution as well.
You spoke favorably about how the White House, President Biden, Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack are tackling this. Is there political will elsewhere, across the aisle, everywhere else, to get where we need to go?
Well, generally, agriculture tends to be pretty bipartisan. It's one of the more bipartisan things. I mean, to be honest with you, there are some on the right who have resisted efforts to really bring climate change reduction as part of a major effort in food and agriculture production. And that's unfortunate, but the land grant schools and the private sector, and with the efforts of this administration, I think are turning things in the right direction.
Very good. Dan Glickman, former congressman from Kansas's 4th Congressional District, former Secretary of Agriculture, and most recently the author of Laughing at Myself, My Education in Congress, on the Farm, and at the Movies, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Secretary Glickman, thank you so much for your time with us today. We'd love to have you back again soon.
I'm delighted, and you can call me tomorrow if you want to. Okay.
Be careful what you wish for.
Okay, all right, okay.
Thanks very much. We appreciate it. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, what would it take for Democrats to win in Wyoming? But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Most people believe the American economy is rigged by and for bankers, CEOs, and other super-rich elites because it is. With their hired armies of lawmakers, lobbyists, lawyers, and the like, they fix the economic rules so ever more of society's money and power flows uphill to them. Take corporate CEOs. While 2020 was somewhere between a downer and devastating for most people, the CEO class made out like bandits, with each of the 3 top-paid corporate honchos pocketing as much as $1 billion in personal pay. Are they geniuses or what? What? All 3 of their corporations ended 2020 with big financial losses and declining value. So how can such mediocrity produce such lavish rewards? Simple. Rig the pay machine. Today's corporate system of setting compensation for top executives is a flim-flam disguised as a model of management rectitude. On its face, it sounds good. Pay for performance, it's called, meaning the CEO does well if the company does well. But who defines doing well? The scam at most major corporations is that the standard of corporate performance that the chief must meet to qualify for a huge payday is set by each corporation's board of directors. Guess who they are? Commonly, board members are the CEO's hand-picked brothers-in-law, golfing buddies, and corporate cronies. So they set the bar for winning multi-million-dollar executive paychecks so low that a sack of concrete could jump over it. This is Jim Hightower saying, well, can't corporate shareholders just vote no on any executive excess? Yes, but corporate rules decree that votes by shareholders are merely advisory, meaning top executives can ignore them, grab the money, and run. The system is fixed, and we need to break it. Howdy-ho, folks. Thanks for tuning in and sharing my weekly commentaries. Also, please join me for a live web show I host every other Tuesday, the Hightower Lowdown Happy Hour at the Chat and Chew Cafe. You can join the action live online as I chat with grassroots leaders and progressive sparklies from around the country. Go to hightowerlowdown.org/chat-and-chew to find out about upcoming guests and watch past episodes. That's hightowerlowdown.org/chat-and-chew.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Democrats face daunting odds in Wyoming, but with a midterm election on the horizon, Joe Barbuto says Democrats can beat those odds with the right strategy. And we say hello to Joe Barbuto, chair of the Wyoming Democratic Party and a Democratic former member of the Wyoming State Legislature representing House District 48 in the 59th through 61st Wyoming legislatures. Joe Barbuto, thanks for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, Jim. I'm glad to be here.
Certainly our pleasure to have you with us. Now, you recently wrote about the strategy of Wyoming Democrats heading into the 2022 election, and you noted that 2020 was not a good year for your party. What are the challenges you face heading into 2022?
You know, in a lot of ways, 2020 was difficult for us, but in a lot of ways, it's been good too. I think if you look at where the Wyoming Democratic Party was in 2016 as compared to where we were in 2020 and going forward, we've really built the organization. In 2020, we have what we believe was likely the most participated in Democratic presidential preference caucus in the history of the state. We have more activists on the ground. We have more active county parties. We have a more robust staff than we've had in quite some time. And that's all from building up since 2017. And so, I think looking forward, our strategy has to be continue to build those resources, create capacity for more, make sure that campaigns, candidates, county parties, and activists have the tools they need to be successful on the ground. Because in a state like Wyoming, we have a sparse population compared to any other state almost. And it's a lot easier to touch more people, to touch more individuals with a campaign message or with information they need in order to vote for a certain candidate or issue or what have you. We can do that here. And so I think that the real challenge will be how do we make sure that we're reaching everybody who needs to be reached? And something we're looking forward to in the next couple of cycles. COVID has kind of slowed us down a little with the resurgence too, but is registering more voters, because we know, give or take, there's about 50% of people who are eligible to vote who aren't voting in the state. And we don't know how they would register, but we do have some information that we could maybe find those who we think would be likely Democratic voters and get them to vote, because if they're not showing up, then we're not winning the elections. And that was just it sounds so simple, but I always ask candidates who wins elections, and they have lots of answers. Who has the better message? Who knows the community better? And those are good answers. But the one I'm always looking for is the person who wins the most votes, which sounds simple, but we weren't really applying that enough to ourselves. And because we have the resources, we have the volunteers, we have great candidates, we're on the right side of issues. I think we share our values with most Wyoming folks. What we just don't have is enough voters, and we don't have enough Republicans in a lot of cases, particularly in the presidential year, who are willing to come over to our side and vote for a Democrat. So we do have to spend some more time and energy looking for new voters as well. So there's a lot of work to be done, but I always say, Wyoming Democrats are the toughest in the nation because we have to be. There are a lot of days where it feels like pushing water uphill with a fork, but then we are seeing more victories, and maybe not always winning an election, which is the best victory, but we're seeing more people turn out. We're getting precinct committee people in place. We're getting those volunteers and activists in place. We have the resources. We're much better outfitted than our friends on the other side of the aisle. We just need those voters now. That's the missing piece.
Now, and your current strategy is focused on recruiting a handful of strong candidates in districts where Democrats are mathematically competitive. But what does that mean for districts where Democrats are less competitive? Does that just kind of leave them out on an island?
No, not at all. In fact, we'll still recruit in those places too. We want good candidates at every level and everywhere running for office as Democrats. But in some of those counties, we know that getting across the finish line as a winner in the race may be less likely. We know where it is demographically, and we know where we've been, but we also know where we're going, and that's the important thing. So working with those county parties and those campaigns in those places to say, what are some other goals that we need to set and reach in order to build the party there, so that in the next cycle, we are more competitive, and the cycle after that, and after that, we just keep building our strength in that district or county. And that can be a lot of things. It can be making sure that a certain percentage of voters get out. It could be making sure that your precinct committee positions are all filled in that county. It could be making sure that you have a number of things. There's a lot of different measures of success that we need to start focusing on in order to build, because that's what we have to do in those places, build the party up. We still have to have strong candidates. We have to have candidates with good resources and support behind them. But we need to make sure those other goals are in place so that we are not staking everything on them winning, that we're still we're working to build.
Mm-hmm. Now, you also wrote about messaging strategy and why it's important to avoid polarizing issues advanced by Democrats in urban districts. So what are some of those issues?
I saw that, and I'm not exactly sure what I wrote there to leave that impression, but I actually have been of the opinion that in the past, Wyoming Democrats have been a little too quick to try and water down their message or play Democrat light. And I think that that's been a turnoff to a lot of voters. I think that they would much rather talk with somebody who has conviction in what they're saying and conviction in their beliefs. And so go out there and we talk about this at our Democrat meetings all the time, go out there and be proud to be a Democrat, be proud to be on the right side of those issues and supporting those important causes, whether it be, equality or workers' rights or public land, which is a big one out here in the West, access to quality health care, funding for public education. We're on the right side of the issue. We need to convince others that we are. We don't need to try and avoid those things, because I think that they are good messages to share that match up with the values of the voters. So, messaging is always a difficult thing. One thing I tell people, though, is that I don't want to be like the Republican Party in Wyoming or nationally, where we tell you what to talk about, where we give you, here's a list of the things we're talking about this week, and here's how you're going to talk about them. We don't want our county parties or our candidates or anybody else to feel like they're being restrained or roped in by the state party. I mean, talk about what's important in your community. Talk about the issues that matter to you. Talk about why you're running, what got you in the race. We really want people we want them to be themselves. We want them they're great candidates. They're great, passionate, smart, and often influential people in their communities, and they need to be having these conversations. So we want to make sure that we're helping them with the part, how do you get that message out there? Not so much of what is your message.
But what kind of messaging, Joe, can work across the state of Wyoming? What are the issues that perhaps might expand Democrats' appeal to more conservative voters? In other words, you're going to try and bring some of those Republicans over the line with you.
Yeah, so when I talk about other successes, that's a good way to bring that up. There are a lot of issues that we're talking about in Wyoming that we wouldn't be talking about if it were not for Democrats starting those conversations. And I think or at least carrying those conversations on further than just one discussion. I think a great example of that is Medicaid expansion. We have several polls and statistics that say most voters in Wyoming understand that Medicaid expansion is the way to go, because there are a lot of folks who don't have access to any kind of healthcare except the emergency room, if there happens to be an emergency room where they live in the state. So that's an issue that impacts everybody, regardless of what letter's behind your name. People want quality healthcare. People want well-funded public education, which is on the chopping block every year with our legislative session. That's something that we can talk about. It strengthens communities, it strengthens families. Having good public education in your community matters to everyone. One I mentioned just a minute ago briefly was public lands. Now that's a big issue out here in the West, because around us, most of the land, I'm in the southwestern corner of the state, and most of the land around us is under federal stewardship, BLM here, the Bureau of Land Management. And that's important to our way of life, because we do spend a lot of time outdoors in Wyoming. We do hunt, fish, recreate. We spend a lot of time on those wild lands. And so it's really imperative that we make sure that we always have access to those. And our access is guaranteed most often by having that federal stewardship. So there are people who want to change that in the state, to change it to state stewardship or some other model. But, even Republicans and Democrats who are utilizing the land for those recreation or hunting purposes or what have you, they understand the importance of that federal stewardship. So that's the kind of message that we need to be talking about. And then, everybody knows, if you're paying attention, that Wyoming is in trouble economically. We have all our eggs in one basket, and that's mineral extraction and energy production. That's the driving force behind our economy, and that economy is changing, and we don't have control over that. It doesn't matter what supply we have if the demand is not there. So we need to be having more robust conversations about how we diversify the economy here, because the fact of the matter is people are losing their jobs, and whether it's directly in the industry or one, supported by the industry, which is just about everything in the state, they're losing those jobs, and they're either struggling here or they're having to move somewhere else where there is another job for them so that they can take care of themselves and their family. And so, there's just not been enough focus on that. It's economic diversification is a buzzword, but right now it's absolutely crucial that we support this full throttle, because people are suffering as a result of our inability to get that done. And those are just a few of the things Democrats are talking about. I think that voters respond to, regardless of their political party or political persuasion.
We're speaking to Joe Barbuto, chair of the Wyoming Democratic Party. He's also a former member of the Wyoming State Legislature representing House District 48. Now, Joe, there are always going to be some Democratic activists that might suggest this kind of strategy amounts to a watering down of what Democrats stand for. How do you respond to that, though?
No, I would say absolutely not. Like I said, we are encouraging Democrats to go out there and talk about how proud they are to be a Democrat and why these issues matter to them and why they should matter to the folks they're talking to as well. I don't think it's a watered down messaging. I think it's probably more aggressive than it has been in the past, actually, and more, for lack of a better term, pro-Democrat, because we do recognize that our values as a party are more in line with the Wyoming working family, the everyday folks here in the state. I think that what happens a lot of times is that you get involved in the culture of something, right? And so here we'll call it the culture of the Republican Party. And so rather than looking at something and saying, well, I believe in A, B, and C, and so I see this political party probably agrees with more of that than the other, they say, well, grandpa was a Republican, dad was a Republican, everybody was a Republican, so let me see, I'm a Republican too, let me now go and see what I believe in, without really maybe giving it the thought. And it doesn't help when you have so much misinformation and misguidance out there from so many political pundits and talking heads and politicians as well. It's sometimes feels hard to find accurate information, and it's easy to get sucked into believing some things that just aren't true. So that's, and it's hard to work against that kind of culture. And it happens with Democrats, I'm sure too, where they're a Democrat, so they believe these things rather than saying, I believe these things, so I'm a Democrat. There's no one way to work against that except to keep moving forward, to keep pushing our messaging and showing that our candidates are, they're smart, articulate, reasonable people who are already and oftentimes contributing to their community in great ways, whether it's through their work or through the volunteer efforts they've made over the years. So I think that it's just a matter of waking up each day and doing the work again.
Now, of course, redistricting.
Yeah.
This is a tough one. It's on the horizon. Republicans in Wyoming are expected to redraw the lines in their favor. What's at stake if they're successful? And what are Wyoming Democrats doing to fight back?
Right. So, there's in the previous redistricting, which was, a decade ago, unfortunately, I don't think that a lot of Democrats, at least not, of course, in the legislature they were, and I was there at that time, but with the party, I don't think that there was enough focus on redistricting and paying attention to what's happening. And of course, federally, we're an at-large congressional district, so we don't worry about that. So that doesn't get any attention or press, but that state legislature redistricting maybe wasn't taken as seriously as it needed to be. So I think a couple of things have changed. I think one is that nationally, Democrats are understanding that redistricting at the state level matters, that state legislature matters, because so much policy right now is being driven by ideologues and state legislators. So it's important that we're paying attention to that. And you have things like, and I can't remember the exact name of the group, I think it's the Democratic Redistricting Committee or something like that, headed up by Eric Holder. And of course, a lot of their focus is going to be has been on what's happening with federal redistricting, but they're also providing some resources, information for states like ours that are just doing that state level redistricting. But next, that most important part is that we're there at those meetings, we're discussing, we haven't seen any maps really, we've seen some proposals about the guidance that the legislative committee is using to get to their process. And so we're paying attention to that and making sure that we're involved, that we'll be at those, both as the party staff, but also volunteers from the county. We'll be at those redistricting meetings. We'll be looking at the maps, we'll be making comments, and we'll be, if something doesn't meet the smell test, as they say, we're going to be there to call it out and do whatever we need to do to make sure that redistricting in the state is fair. And frankly, it's ridiculous, in my opinion. I don't think we have anything in the party bylaws or a resolution or anything saying this, but it's really ridiculous that we allow legislators to draw their own districts. But that's what happens in Wyoming. And so we do need to be especially mindful of the opportunities that may exist for people to gerrymander. But we're paying attention. And like I said, we have the national resources to back us up if we need to make some noise. But we'll be a part of the process.
Yeah, it's amazing when you look at some of the redistricting maps across various states, and it looks like a Rorschach blot that you get tested with from time to time, and it's just they don't make any sense at all. So it's great that you all are keeping a strong eye on that, and you'll be able to get the word out when things, as you say, don't pass the smell test. Lastly, your party recently issued a statement on Representative Liz Cheney's ouster as House GOP conference chair because of her criticism of Donald Trump. Why did you feel a need to do so?
Well, I mean, it's obviously a topic that's on the minds of a lot of folks in Wyoming, and politically, it is the topic of discussion right now. Is still Liz Cheney and all these people challenging her. So with our messaging on that, and we haven't done a ton. We want to be careful because we're not we're not fans of Ms. Cheney. She was right on January 6th. She was right to vote yes on impeachment, and her service on this committee, looking at it, is the right thing to do. But the fact of the matter is Donald Trump was not just awful on January 6th. That's not when it came to light. There were 4 years before that where she was with him, and he was doing a lot of awful things that she should have called out. And it was when we knew he wasn't going to be the president going forward that I guess it felt okay to call him out. And I think that she does believe he was despicable, and I think she does believe that he bears a lot of responsibility for January 6th, and that's all good. But it still, in my mind at least, doesn't excuse the fact that she has not been vocal enough against the administration and some of the things he said and some of the policies that they carried out. She occasionally would, on foreign affair issues and military issues, part ways with them, but not nearly enough when it really counted, when we really needed that leadership. And so now, it's one of those things. People say, well, of that primary that's happening, she's got several opponents. We don't want any of them there in DC representing Wyoming, and of course we don't. But I always ask him, what would be different? What would be because other than the Donald Trump issue, they mostly agree. I mean, they'd be shoulder to shoulder on a lot of these issues, these primary candidates and Liz Cheney. The only thing that maybe would be different in a lot of cases is that they have a lot less name recognition. They don't have any power. They don't have a voice that's going to be heard constantly. So I just don't think that we need to turn around and start being big Liz Cheney fans. And it's going to be interesting to see how this thing plays out, because you do have a lot of people running against her right now, and they're all staking their reputations on the fact that they worship at the altar of Trump, right? I mean, they are 100% behind Trump. Well, Donald Trump says he's going to make an endorsement in that primary race, and it may turn out that he's not 100% for them. And so what do they do at that point when their idol, the person they care about most in this world, says, sorry, I'm going with the other guy? Do they drop out? Do they love Trump more, or is their own ego and ambition going to keep them in the race? And that's going to be what saves Liz Cheney in 2022 in that primary, I think, because I don't think they'll drop out. I think that just like they always do in Wyoming, those far-right candidates, far-right voters can't coalesce around one candidate, and so they do oftentimes miss out. But it'll be interesting to see. I don't think that it matters much to Liz Cheney at this point, honestly. I don't think representing Wyoming was ever her goal in life. I think, although she had a lot of name recognition already, just because of the family she comes from, I think her primary interest in being a congressperson was to raise her profile even more in preparation for a bigger run. And she's done that. I mean, she is there. If she were to lose that congressional race in 2022, I still expect that she would be considering a race in 2024. And she staked a lot to herself on, between now and then, a lot of bad things coming out about Donald Trump, and her being the only person on that presidential debate stage in 2024, the primary debate stage anyhow, who can say, hey, I was the only one who saw him for what he was. I was the only one who stood up against Donald Trump while you guys were all, bowing at the altar. It's not that different than when Barack Obama could say on this debate stage, hey, I'm the one who voted against the Iraq war. It's the same kind of moment. So anyhow, I don't think that Liz is going forward blindly. I think she has a very definite plan ahead, and that she's going to stick to it. She's going to stick to it.
Mm-hmm. Joe Barbuto, chair of the Wyoming Democratic Party, former member of the Wyoming State Legislature, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Joe, appreciate all the work that you're doing. We're cheering on the Wyoming Democrats as hard as we can back east. We wish you the best of luck, and would love to have you back again soon.
Oh, anytime. Thank you guys for having me. It's been fun.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with national election law expert Rick Hasan on the mounting threat Republicans pose to election integrity.
a series that we've been doing on the Bill Press podcast about the insurrection of January 6th and Donald Trump's role in it. And we've been looking, Rick, particularly at the physical attack on the Capitol on January 6th and that failed coup d'etat. I want to ask you and turn to you as an elections law and expert on what you think is coming next. And let me start this way by saying it appears to me that the attempt to overturn the last election has failed. That's pretty clear. Joe Biden is in the Oval Office. August 13 came and went. Donald Trump did not get back in the Oval Office, as he indicated. It's also clear to me, though, that having failed to overturn one election, that the Trumpers, Republican legislators across the country, are now focused on undermining the election process itself. Is that true? And if so, how are they doing it?
So I do think that this is a great danger that we face. And the worry is that 2020 was not a one-off event, but instead kind of a dress rehearsal for what might come. And so this is the danger of election subversion. And it's analytically distinct from the question of voter suppression. Voter suppression, we're all familiar with now. Georgia passes a law and says that you can't offer water to people waiting on a long line to vote. Okay, so we know what that is. But election subversion is something else. It's messing with the rules for how elections are conducted and making it possible that the winner who is declared is not the actual winner of the election. So that's really scary. So how could that happen? Well, one thing we know from 2020 is that it took people with integrity to assure that the election was not stolen. So when the president calls up the Secretary of State of Georgia, Brad Raffensperger, and says to him, I need you to find me 11,000 votes, Raffensperger says no and releases the recording. Well, Raffensperger has now been removed from his power on the state election board. Someone who's running against him is a congressman named Jody Heiss, who parrots Trump's false claims about the election. All right, so one way that we might have a problem next time is that people are being put in power down at the precinct level, but going all the way up to secretaries of state and members of Congress who are parroting the big lie and who are making claims that the election in 2020 was stolen, which could pave the way for shenanigans in 2024. So that's one way. Another way that things are happening is that laws are changing. And so there was a bill introduced in Arizona which would give the state legislature the ability to second guess the winner of the presidential election, have the legislature assign its own electors. That bill hasn't gotten very far, but it wouldn't surprise me if that continues. And we've seen further laws passed that try to criminalize very basic activities that election officials go in. So in Iowa, for example, if you're a local election official and you send out an absentee ballot application, not the ballot, but an application for someone to apply for an absentee ballot without the voter having first requested it, you could be committing a crime. So people are being deterred from serving as election officials, which again opens up the possibility of both error, because untrained people could be running elections, but also deliberate chicanery, which is why we need transparency rules that we don't have to assure that our elections are going to be run fairly. And of course, there were over 140 members of Congress who voted to object to the election results in Pennsylvania and in Arizona, despite the fact that there was no evidence whatsoever that the election results did not reflect the will of the people in those states. So they were just willing to ignore the facts and just embrace a lie. And so if it ultimately falls to Congress, and there are a number of members of Congress who are willing to take this stance, then how can we trust that the election results are going to be fair next time?
Right. Those members of Congress who voted to overturn the electoral, to change the electoral college, if you will, in Arizona and Pennsylvania on the very evening of the day of the coup, right, where they had to run for their lives, and still
not only that. Remember, a lot of those people won in the same election. So was it fraud only as to Biden? I mean, talk about if you're going to steal the election, you might as well go all the way, right?
So you're contending that election subversion is more dangerous and more lasting than election suppression.
So I don't think voter suppression is something to minimize, but there are ways around it. So you impose a strict voter ID law. Well, okay, then you organize people and get as many people as possible IDs. You work with the rules that you have to try to make things as fair as possible. But when you're talking about the counting of votes, I mean, now we're getting into really the very basic core of what a democracy is. A democracy is a free and fair contest where the losers accept the results as legitimate and agree to fight another day. If you don't have that, you don't have the very basic form of democracy.
So the people who are behind these changes, I hear them all the time. They're saying that, and let's start with Greg Abbott, governor of Texas, that our goal is to restore public faith in the electoral process, which was shattered on November 3rd, 2020. What's your response to them?
So it's a mixture of chutzpah and bootstrapping, right? So here you have Republicans undermining voter confidence in the election by claiming that it's rife with fraud when it's not, and then passing new restrictive voting laws in the name of promoting voter confidence. Now, I think the reason these laws are being passed, I think there's three reasons, right? One is there's pressure from below. That is, this is the issue that causes the Republican base to be the most excited because the Republican base is Trumpist. They believe Trump's false claims, and they're demanding action. So something has to be passed in these states. And I think the things that are passed are not nearly as bad as the things that could be passed, in part because there's pressure from corporations and from civic groups and others to water them down. Number two, there's pressure coming from above. Trump has not quietly gone away. He's doubled down on his statements. He's continuing to claim the fraud. And so if you're a elected official who's a Republican and you don't toe the line, as we just saw with Liz Cheney, you're going to get President Trump coming in and endorsing your opponent. And then the third place it's coming from are legislators who believe that changing these rules will help them electorally, either help the Republican Party or help them. So pressure from below, pressure from above, and self-interest are all driving these laws. What's not driving these laws is actually a need to improve the election process. Because if that's what you're trying to do, you wouldn't be passing laws like this. You'd be doing other things.
Where does the power to control an election, lay down the rules for an election reside? Does it differ in every state? Or state by state? Is it with the state legislature, with local officials, or with Congress?
Yes, that's a very complicated question.
Sorry.
I can give you the basic answer.
Okay.
Which is that the power in federal elections is divided. For congressional elections, it's divided. So Article 1 of the Constitution says that states can set the rules for congressional elections subject to federal override. So when the federal government, for example, says in the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, states have to offer voter registration opportunities in welfare offices and in motor vehicle departments, that's the federal government that is overriding what states do. But when the federal government doesn't, then states can run their elections as they see fit, and they can devolve certain powers to local authorities. So it's a mix of all three. Mm-hmm. For presidential elections, Article 2 of the Constitution says that state legislatures get to set the manner for conducting those elections. And the Supreme Court in the 2000 case of Bush versus Gore, which ended the disputed 2000 election, said in that opinion, in 2000, just 20 years ago, said that although all states have given the power to choose electors to voters in their states, state legislatures can take back that power at any time. So the state of Texas could pass a law and it says, we're not holding an election for president. The state legislature is just going to choose the presidential electors. That's still constitutional, amazingly so. Then when it comes to state and local elections, state and local governments generally have the power, as defined in each state's constitution, to decide what the rules are. But Congress can come in and try to legislate over some of these rules, because Congress has power in various amendments to the Constitution, including the 14th Amendment guaranteeing equal protection and due process, the 15th Amendment barring racial discrimination in voting, the 19th Amendment barring gender discrimination in voting. Congress can come in and can pass certain laws that apply to state and local elections, like, for example, when Congress in 1965 passed the Voting Rights Act. It didn't just apply to congressional elections, it applied to state and local elections as well. But in recent years, the Supreme Court has become more conservative and more skeptical of Congress's power to regulate these other elections. Witness the 2013 decision in Shelby County versus Holder, which killed off a key provision of the Voting Rights Act, or just this past summer's decision in Brnovich versus Democratic National Committee, which severely weakened another provision of the Voting Rights Act, both of which protect minority voters from discrimination.
So you're saying that if, let's pick a state, right, Arizona, the electors were going to come to Washington to vote for Joe Biden in 2024, and Donald Trump were on the ballot, and the state legislature, controlled by Republicans, didn't want that to happen, they could actually override what the voters of Arizona, how they had voted, and send electors for Donald Trump to Washington?
No, not quite. What I'm saying is that they could pass a law before the election and say, we're not holding an election, we're just choosing the president ourselves.
Got it. Yeah.
What happened this past election is that...
But still, that would be denying voters, right, the opportunity under the Constitution to choose the electors.
But they don't have a right in the Constitution to choose the electors. The Constitution says in Article 2 that for presidents, state legislatures get to set the manner of choosing presidential electors. And the Supreme Court, as I said, as recently as 2000 said that state legislatures can take that power back. Now, in 2020, all states did allow a vote for president.
Right.
But there's a very complicated old law called the Electoral Count Act. It was passed after a disputed election back in 1876. This law was passed in 1887. And it's very complicated, very hard to read. But there's a provision in it that says if a state fails to make a choice of electors on election day, the state legislature can submit a slate of electors. Like, it's a fail-safe provision. So if there's a failure, let's say there's a terrible natural disaster or terrorist attack or something, and a state can't hold its election, there's a backup provision. And what Trump was trying to do was to inject this idea of fraud, get state legislatures to declare their elections fraudulent and to send in an additional slate of electors, and then try and get it to the Congress where there would be a dispute over which electoral college votes should count, leading to another fail-safe provision in the Constitution, which says that if nobody gets a majority when Congress votes, then you do this one state delegation in the House, one vote rule, where Republicans control more delegations than Democrats do, and you end up with a second term for Trump. That was the Hail Mary game that was trying to be played back then.
So we've talked about Arizona and Pennsylvania. We mentioned a few other states. Is there a nationally organized effort now to undermine the election process across the country? Or is it just popping up in state after state?
Well, so we know that the Heritage Foundation and ALEC, two conservative organizations, have been going around proposing election legislation, some of which has been adopted. It's not clear to me exactly what, how organized it is, but we are seeing parallel efforts going on in different states. So when Arizona decides to conduct this sham audit of their votes, well, now it's spreading to something happening in Wisconsin, something happening in Pennsylvania. Again, not clear that this is going to have any real world effect other than further undermining people's confidence in the process.
But it's not just in one state, right? So what is were all these efforts successful? What would that mean to our democratic process and to fair elections in this country?
So already we have damage to our democracy because there are millions and millions of people who believe that the 2020 election was not fairly conducted, that the election was stolen, that Biden didn't actually win the election because Donald Trump and others have perpetuated this fraud across the country, and people believe it. And if you don't believe that your leaders were democratically elected, you're going to have less allegiance to that government. You're going to believe it's okay to cheat, to take back your government, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that itself is dangerous, but I'm worried that next time we could have an actual successful subversion where the loser is actually declared the winner, right? And that is really the end of American democracy, at least for this period of time.
I guess which hasn't happened since, as you mentioned, 1876 and Samuel Tilden and Rutherford B. Hayes.
Or we can go back and talk about the 1960 election of John F. Kennedy in Chicago. But in modern times, let's say over the last 50 to 60 years, I think we do have good confidence that our elections were fairly conducted in the United States.
So you have said that this next time, were they successful, would be, I guess your phrase is a much more respectable coup, right? A bloodless coup. They wouldn't have to storm the Capitol. They would do it, I guess, legally by passing these laws. Is that what you're saying?
Well, so in the piece you're referring to, which appeared in Slate, I was talking about how there could be certain legal arguments to try to overturn election results, the kinds of legal arguments that would be more appealing to the conservative judges that Trump was able to put on the courts than the arguments about fraud, which were pretty much uniformly rejected by these Trump appointed judges, right? So those charges got no traction because they were neither legally supported nor factually supported. So, what I was talking about is a kind of complex lawyerly argument that could help to overturn election results. And I can walk you through it if you want, but it's something called the independent state legislature doctrine. And it would provide the kind of argument.
That's very important. No, please do. And I think that's sort of the summation of what these people could claim, right?
Well, so there's kind of the brute force coup. There's the, state legislatures trying to appoint electors for no reason and Congress accepting it, which would also be, to me, extra legal or, violating democratic norms. Or then there's this other idea. So let's go back to 2020. We had a very difficult election because of COVID. We had lots of lawsuits either requiring states to change their election rules because they were not sufficiently taking into account COVID, or being sued for changing their rules to accommodate COVID. So one of those lawsuits took place in Pennsylvania. And the argument was that it's a lot harder for people to vote because of the pandemic and to vote by mail. And we're having trouble with the USPS. You may remember there were slowdowns of the mail during this period.
Yep.
And so someone sued and said, we need to extend the deadline for the receipt of ballots that come in from the mail on Election Day. And the state Supreme Court, relying on the state constitution, not the U.S. Constitution, but Pennsylvania's constitution, which guarantees free and fair elections, ruled that under the state constitution, the ballots that came in had to be received within 3 days of Election Day. So the state statute passed by the legislature said they've got to be received on Election Day. The state Supreme Court said, no, we're going to extend it 3 extra days because that is going to protect the constitutional rights of Pennsylvanians under the state constitution. So then Republicans sued. They went to the U.S. Supreme Court and they said, when the state Supreme Court, relying on the state constitution, extended the number of days to receive the ballots, they violated the U.S. Constitution because the U.S. Constitution gives state legislatures, the power to pass election rules. And anything that's done in derogation of the state legislature's power, that is a violation of the U.S. Constitution. And this theory, called the independent state legislature doctrine, garnered the support of 4 justices on the Supreme Court, and possibly 5 or 6. If the election had come down to Pennsylvania, and if it had come down to those ballots, I think we very well could have had a different result in the presidential election, because I think a majority of the Supreme Court could have changed the outcome of the election. Fortunately, there were only about 10,000 ballots that came in the 3-day period, and Biden won the state by 80,000 votes. And so those 10,000 votes didn't matter.
Bill Press with national election law expert Rick Hasan. If you'd like to hear the entire episode, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Dan Glickman, Joe Barbuto, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.